From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We stand at a critical point in our history. Already at the beginning of the year, we are facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the creation of the United Nations. Now, more than 20 million people across 4 countries face starvation and famine. Without collective and coordinated global efforts, people will simply starve to death.
As Donald Trump seeks to cut $20 billion in funding for the United Nations, the UN is facing an unprecedented crisis as Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen all face famine at the same time. We'll get the latest. Plus, we'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist David K. Johnston, who just obtained 2 pages of Donald Trump's 2005 tax return. It shows most of the taxes Trump paid were due to a special tax on high earners that he's now trying to abolish. But is there any hope the nation will see more of Trump's tax information?
You know, the only one that cares about my tax returns are the reporters, okay? They're the only ones. But no, I don't think so. I won. I mean, I became president. No, I don't think they care at all. I don't think they care at all. I think you care. I think you care. And
we look at how the state of Arkansas is racing to execute 8 men within a 10-day period in April. Arkansas says it's rushing the executions because the state's supply of the sedative midazolam will soon expire. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Calls are growing for President Trump to release his full tax returns after part of his 2005 return was made public Tuesday. 2 pages from Trump's tax return were obtained by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnston of D.C. Report, who appeared last night on The Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC. The 2005 tax return shows Trump earned $153 million, or more than $400,000 a day. Trump paid out $36.6 million in federal income taxes, much of it in the form of what's known as the alternative minimum tax, which Trump now wants to eliminate. The document also shows Trump wrote off more than $100 million in business losses to reduce his federal taxes. This morning, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Does anybody really believe that a reporter who nobody ever heard of went to his mailbox and found my tax returns? NBC News, fake news," unquote. That's despite the fact that the White House confirmed the authenticity of the documents Tuesday after Maddow teased the scoop. The White House continues to refuse to release any other tax returns from Trump. We'll have more on Trump's tax returns later in the broadcast with journalist David K. Johnston. House Republicans are demanding changes to the Republican plan to repeal and replace Affordable Care Act after the Congressional Budget Office said the plan would lead 24 million people to lose their health insurance within a decade. Some Republicans pulled their support following Monday's report, including Florida Congressmember Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who tweeted, quote, "As written, the plan leaves too many from my district uninsured," unquote. During a news briefing Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer conceded millions would lose their health insurance under the plan as it's currently written. This is Spicer being questioned by CNN's Jim Acosta.
And so getting back to the Congressional Budget Office score, would you concede that there will be some coverage losses, perhaps in the millions, that there will be millions of people who will not have health insurance as a result of what you're doing?
Well, again, sure, except you have to look at the current situation. You are mandated by law to buy insurance right now under Obamacare.
Demonstrations against the Republican effort to repeal and replace Obamacare continued Tuesday as hundreds braved a blizzard to protest outside House Speaker Paul Ryan's office in Racine, Wisconsin. Also on Tuesday, President Trump's pick to run Medicare and Medicaid, Seema Verma, was sworn in by Vice President Mike Pence after she was confirmed by the Senate Monday. Verma's health policy firm helped design Indiana's Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, during which time she worked closely with Vice President Pence. President Trump is reportedly considering appointing Mark Mukasey, who's represented former Fox News chair Roger Ailes, to replace Preet Bharara as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Bharara was heading up an investigation into Fox News at the time Trump fired him after Bharara refused to resign. If nominated and confirmed, Mukasey would likely be forced to recuse himself from the ongoing investigation into whether Fox News failed to inform shareholders about numerous settlements with some of the more than 20 women who have accused former chair Roger Ailes of sexual harassment. Meanwhile, Michigan Democratic Congressmember John Conyers is demanding the Justice Department reveal all pending investigations into President Trump and the Trump family's businesses. In a statement issued Saturday, Congressmember John Conyers cited the firing of Manhattan U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, writing, quote, "It's particularly problematic that the administration would fire Mr. Bharara, given Mr. Bharara could be reviewing a range of potential improper activity emanating from Trump Tower and the Trump campaign, as well as entities with financial ties to the president or the Trump organization." Michigan Congressmember Conyers wrote, meanwhile, Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse says FBI Director James Comey has said he'll tell Congress today whether the FBI is investigating any connections between Russia and Trump's presidential campaign. Trump has tapped Goldman Sachs banker James Donovan to be Deputy Treasury Secretary. If confirmed, Donovan would work directly for another former Goldman Sachs banker, now Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Trump has also tapped another half-dozen more people tied to Goldman Sachs to join his administration, including National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn, Trump chief strategist Stephen Bannon, Securities and Exchange Commission chair nominee Jay Clayton, senior White House advisor Anthony Scaramucci, and senior counselor for economic initiatives Dina Habib Powell. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said Tuesday President Trump is extremely confident the Justice Department will find evidence to back up his unsubstantiated claims that President Obama tapped Trump's phones during the 2016 election.
He feels very confident that what will ultimately come of this will vindicate him.
Spicer's comments came only one day after Spicer tried to back away from the claim, saying Trump did not literally mean wiretapping and that Trump did not mean it was ordered by President Obama directly.
The president used the word wiretap in quotes to mean broadly surveillance and other activities during that. And that is, again, something, it is interesting how many news outlets reported that this activity was taking place during the 2016 election cycle, and now are wondering where the proof is. It is many of the same outlets in this room that talked about the activities that were going on back then.
That was Sean Spicer speaking on Monday. Spicer's claim directly contradicts a March 4th tweet by the president, in which the wiretap claim is made without quotation marks. The tweet read, quote, "How low has President Obama gone to tap my phones during the very sacred election process? This is Nixon Watergate. Bad or sick guy, exclamation point," end quote. The deadline has now been extended for the Justice Department to turn over evidence supporting Trump's unsubstantiated allegations Obama wiretapped him to the House Intelligence Committee. The Justice Department failed to meet the first deadline. South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has also demanded the FBI hand over any evidence about the alleged wiretap to the Senate Judiciary Committee, saying Tuesday if the agency doesn't respond to his letter, quote, "they're about to screw up big time," unquote. Reflecting the growing and acrimonious divisions within the Republican Party over its embattled health care plan, the far right-wing news outlet Breitbart, previously headed by White House chief strategist Stephen Bannon, has published an audio recording of an October conference call in which House Speaker Paul Ryan says he would never defend then-Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump.
Two things that I want to make really clear. As for myself as your speaker, I am not going to defend Donald Trump. Not now, not in the future. As you probably heard, I just invited him from my first congressional district GOP event this weekend, a thing I do every year. And I'm not going to be campaigning with him over the next 30 days.
Speaker Ryan's comments came after the release of the 2005 videotape recorded by NBC's Access Hollywood showing Trump boasting about sexually assaulting women.
Some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
That was Donald Trump. Despite Speaker Ryan's pledge during the conference call, he began working with President Trump immediately after the November election, vowing to help lead a unified Republican government. Legal challenges to President Trump's revised travel ban are mounting as the order is set to take effect at 12:01 p.m. Thursday. Federal judges in both Hawaii and Maryland are slated to hear arguments today claiming the ban targets Muslims and is a violation of the First Amendment. Trump's executive order would bar refugees from entering the country for 120 days and would bar all people from Iran, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen from entering the United States for 90 days. President Trump met with Saudi Arabia's Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at the White House Tuesday, during which the two reportedly discussed their opposition to the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Prince Mohammed and President Trump were also expected to discuss U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia for the ongoing Saudi-led war in Yemen, which has killed thousands of civilians. Amnesty International urged Trump to block future arms sales, writing, quote, "Arming the Saudi Arabia and Bahraini governments risks complicity with war crimes, and doing so while simultaneously banning travel to the U.S. from Yemen would be even more unconscionable," they wrote. The White House has reportedly instructed the State Department to look for ways to cut more than a third of its budget. This could include slashing in half the United States' annual $10 million in funding for UN programs such as peacekeeping, vaccines, and children's aid. The outline of President Trump's preliminary budget is slated to be released on Thursday. The New York Times reports Trump's Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch has multiple ties to Colorado billionaire Philip Anschutz, an oil baron who now also owns railroads, real estate, sports teams and stadiums, and conservative newspapers like the Weekly Standard and the Washington Examiner. Judge Gorsuch has represented Anschutz and his companies. Anschutz, whose fortune is estimated to top $12 billion, went on to lobby the Bush administration to tap Gorsuch to the Federal Appeals Court. The Senate Judiciary Committee is slated to consider Gorsuch's nomination for the Supreme Court next week. Voters in the Netherlands are heading to the polls today in a closely watched presidential race, which pits Prime Minister Mark Rutte against far-right politician Geert Wilders. This is Wilders in the final debate before today's vote.
If we don't dare to see Islam for what it is, the problem will not only be jihad, but Islam itself. Then the Netherlands and the free Western countries could no longer exist. We should not tolerate this.
That was far-right politician Geert Wilders, who has been surging in the polls in recent days. He's vowed to close all mosques and ban the Quran if elected. He was found guilty by a Dutch court of inciting racial discrimination last year. He's also called for the Netherlands to leave the European Union. The European Court of Justice ruled Tuesday that companies across the European Union can prohibit workers from wearing headscarves as part of company-wide policies banning all religious or political symbols. Religious freedom groups came out against the ruling. The Open Society Justice Initiative said, quote, "It will lead to Muslim women being discriminated against in the workplace, but also Jewish men who wear kippahs, Sikh men who wear turbans, people who wear crosses. It affects all of them, but disproportionately Muslim women," they wrote. Reuters is reporting Russia appears to have deployed special operations troops to an air base in Egypt near the border with Libya. Citing unnamed U.S. and Egyptian officials, Reuters reports the deployment signals a possible Russian intervention in the conflict in Libya on behalf of Libyan military commander Khalifa Haftar, who opposes the U.S. and UN-backed government of national unity based in Tripoli. Egypt has publicly denied any Russian troops are on Egyptian soil. The Wall Street Journal is reporting President Trump has given the CIA expanded authority to carry out lethal drone strikes, a reversal of President Obama's policies of limiting the CIA's ability to carry out such strikes. Meanwhile, NBC News has reported Trump has taken steps to make it easier for both the Pentagon and the CIA to carry out lethal drone strikes. The moves involve declaring parts of Yemen and Somalia areas of active hostilities, giving the agencies greater powers to carry out the strikes. A federal grand jury has indicted 9 high-ranking active and retired Navy members as part of an investigation into a bribery scandal known as Fat Leonard. The Justice Department says the 9 have been charged with accepting luxurious dinners, trips, gifts, and service of sex workers as bribes in exchange for handing over classified military information to Singapore-based defense contractor Leonard Francis. Acting U.S. Attorney in San Diego, Alana Robinson, said, quote, "This is fleecing and betrayal of the United States Navy in epic proportions, and it was allegedly carried out by the Navy's highest-ranking officers," she said. The Senate Armed Services Committee questioned Marine Corps Commandant General Robert Neller on Tuesday. over the growing scandal over an invite-only 30,000-person Facebook group where male Marines have been posting thousands of naked or sexually suggestive photos of their fellow female Marines, along with a barrage of misogynistic comments, including some saying the women should be raped. This is New York Senator Kristen Gillibrand.
Investigated and found guilty anybody. If we can't crack Facebook, how are we supposed to be able to confront Russian aggression and cyber hacking throughout our military? It is a serious problem when we have members of our military denigrating female Marines who will give their life to this country in the way they have, with no response from leadership.
And newly released research shows hate crimes in major cities across the United States surged more than 20% last year. The data released Monday by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University San Bernardino shows there were more than 1,000 hate-related crimes committed in 2016, a 23% increase over 2015. The center's director, Brian Levin, says the number of hate crimes appears to have increased following the election of President Trump. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Calls are growing for President Trump to release his full tax returns after part of his 2005 return was made public Tuesday. 2 pages from Trump's tax return were obtained by Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist David K. Johnston of D.C. Report, who appeared last night on The Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC. Soon after Maddow teased her big scoop, the White House confirmed the authenticity of the documents, but the White House continues to refuse to release any other tax returns from Trump. The 2005 tax return shows Trump earned $153 million. That's more than $400,000 a day. Trump paid out $36.6 million in federal income taxes, much of it in the form of what's known as the alternative minimum tax, which Trump now wants to eliminate. The document also shows Trump wrote off more than $100 million in business losses to reduce his federal taxes. But the documents also leave many questions unanswered about Trump's finances and his sources of income. In January, Trump dismissed calls to release his tax returns.
Will you release your tax returns to prove what you're saying about no deals in Russia?
Well, I'm not releasing the tax returns because, as you know, they're under audit.
But every president since the 70s...
Oh, gee, I've never heard that. Oh, gee, I've never heard that. I've never heard that. You know, the only one that cares about my tax returns are the reporters, okay? They're the only ones. But no, I don't think so. I won.
Do you believe...
I mean, I became president. No, I don't think they care at all. I don't think they care at all. I think you care. I think you care.
This morning, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Does anybody really believe that a reporter who nobody heard of went to his mailbox and found my tax returns? NBC News, fake news," unquote. That's despite the fact that the White House confirmed the authenticity of the documents on Tuesday. For more, we're joined by that man that Donald Trump is describing, David K. Johnston, the journalist who obtained the 2 pages of Donald Trump's 2005 1040 tax forms. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, David. Well, this morning, Donald Trump is questioning how you got those tax returns.
Yeah, I must have gotten under Donald's skin pretty deeply that he's issued this tweet to whoever heard of me. I don't know. Donald and I have been talking to each other for 30 years, and clearly he is at war with his own press office. By the way, I'm very pleased, Amy, that you got correctly in your intro facts that both my former newspaper, the New York Times, and the Washington Post got wrong. You had the right amount of tax and some other figures that were wrong in those major newspapers. And I think that says a lot about the quality of the work that you do, and your viewers should know that.
Well, David, can you talk about how you got these 2 pages of his 2005 tax return?
I was in Palm Beach on Monday, and I had my cell phone in hand, and I was shooting pictures across the water of Mar-a-Lago because I'm working on a new Trump biography, a second one. I have one out now, this one for Simon & Schuster, when I got a text from one of my 8 grown children, said to call right away, and she had opened the mail at our home in Rochester, New York, and here was this envelope with the 2 pages of tax data. So I immediately, began to go to work on it so that we could get the story out right away at DCReport.org.
So talk about what you see in these 2 pages, what you found, David, most significant.
Well, the most significant thing, I believe, is that Donald Trump wants to eliminate the alternative minimum tax. Almost all affluent Americans, people who own a home, have more than 2 children, and live in the high-tax states, are on and make more than $75,000 or $80,000 a year, are on the alternative minimum tax. Because of the alternative minimum tax, Donald paid $36.6 million in income tax. But if that was repealed, and he wants to repeal it, he would have paid only $5 million of income tax on $153 million of income. That is a tax rate of less than 3.5%. You know who pays a 3.5% tax rate in this country? The poorest half of Americans. They pay a little more than 3.5%. Donald Trump would have paid a lower tax rate than people who make less than $33,000 a year if his tax plan had been in effect in 2005. So, when Donald Trump says, I'm the champion here of working people, don't pay attention to that. When he says, wages are too high, that's one sign. But here's one: his tax plan. Man, you make $600 a week, you'd be more heavily taxed than he is.
So how did he end up paying the amount of taxes he did?
Well, Donald had $103 million of negative income. Now, that may be a hard concept for people to get around, but in tax law, you can have a negative income, just like your bank account can be overdrawn and then you have a negative bank balance. Donald's negative income, I'm pretty confident, comes from a dubious tax shelter that he bought in 1995. That allowed him to get out of a very big tax bill. Donald did not pay back to his bankers $918 million that he borrowed from them. Now, ordinary people, they have to pay taxes on that. If you borrow money from a bank and don't pay it back, that's taxable income according to the U.S. Congress. Donald bought a tax shelter that turned it into tax savings for him. Now, when the Republicans in Congress learned about this tax shelter, they shut it down right away. I mean, it was just considered odious. It only took them a couple days to shut it down. It was incredible how fast they moved in Congress to do this. But as often is the case, our Congress said, oh, those of you who already bought this dubious tax shelter, you can keep your ill-got tax savings. And so Donald had $918 million that he could write off of negative income against his positive income. And this return, 11 years later, shows that he had $103 million left, although he may have had some additional tax losses in the meantime. But assuming that that represents the residue from the $918 million, it also tells us that Donald's average income from 1995 through 2004 was $81.5 million a year.
What doesn't the 2 pages tell us?
Well, it doesn't tell us a lot of really important things we need to know. It doesn't tell us who are the sources of his income. It's only the kinds of income he gets: capital gains, business profits, wages. We don't know how much money Donald is getting from the Russian oligarchs. We know he gets money from the Russian oligarchs, but we don't know how much. And the Russian oligarchs are essentially a state-sponsored network of international criminals. Secondly, we don't know who his partners are in the various entities he has. Donald has over 500 partnerships and S corporations and other business entities. Third, and perhaps most important, we don't know who he is paying money to. We know he's borrowed a lot of money from the Bank of China. It's kind of remarkable to think about having a Republican president in the United States who has borrowed a huge sum from a communist government-owned bank, which, by the way, is also the biggest tenant in Trump Tower. So, we really need to know on matters both of criminality and national security who the president is doing business with, who his partners are, who his sources of income are, who he is paying fees to, and who's paying fees to him. And we need his complete tax returns for the last 30 years to do that. And other people running for office, Hillary Clinton, for example, have made public their complete tax returns going back into the 1970s.
So that's very interesting about China, considering Donald Trump is very laudatory of Russia. There's been a lot been made about his relationship with Russian oligarchs, but you don't hear as much about China.
Right. Well, and right now there is a deal in which a sketchy Chinese company is proposing to buy 666 Fifth Avenue, New York. That's a building owned by the family of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And the offer is apparently for $1 billion more than the Kushners paid for the building a decade ago. The Kushners get all sorts of other special goodies in this, and this certainly raises the specter of whether the Beijing government may have decided that the best way to have decent relations with this White House is to bribe the president's family.
I want to ask you about the White House statement yesterday. Today, they're questioning how you got these documents. I mean, clearly, Donald Trump knows exactly who you are, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who worked for years at the New York Times. You wrote a book about Donald Trump. But last night, the White House said, just before you went to air, they wrote, "You know you're desperate for ratings when you're willing to violate the law to push a story about 2 pages of tax returns from over a decade ago. Before being elected president, Mr. Trump was one of the most successful businessmen in the world with a responsibility to his company, his family, and his employees to pay no more tax than legally required. That being said, Mr. Trump paid $38 million, even after taking into account large-scale depreciation for construction on an income of more than $150 million, as well as paying tens of millions of dollars in other taxes, such as sales and excise taxes and employment taxes. And this illegally published return proves that. Despite this substantial income figure and tax paid, it's totally illegal to steal and publish tax returns. The dishonest media can continue to make this part of their agenda while the president will focus on his, which includes tax reform that will benefit all Americans." Again, that from the White House last night. These illegally acquired and published, rather, tax returns. So, David K. Johnston, can you respond?
Yeah, Amy, there is so much falsehood in that statement, including the amount of tax the president paid. He paid $36.6 million, not $38 million. It just makes my head spin. It is absolutely well-established law in the United States that when a journalist receives a document that they did not solicit, then they can publish it. And there's nothing illegal whatsoever about publishing this. This is part of the effort by Donald Trump to confuse people, and that furthers his very authoritarian views. I mean, Donald clearly talks about his office as the president is a dictator. Judges don't agree with him, bad judges, etc. And what happened here is somebody familiar with my work, and I'm very well known for my coverage of taxes. I won a Pulitzer Prize. I've been called the de facto chief tax enforcement officer of the United States because of my exposés of the tax system. Decided to send me, rather than some other journalist, this document. Maybe it was sent to other journalists and they haven't looked in their mailbox. My report on what's in that is absolutely accurate. The White House confirmed it. And you know, Amy, the White House did something actually quite unethical yesterday. I've been dealing with White Houses since Richard Nixon. I've been at this 50 years and I've been dealing with White Houses since Nixon. I have never before sent the White House a document to allow them to comment on it and had them take my exclusive story and give the information to other reporters. And that's what they did. They never responded to me. They instead went to other reporters and said, here's what's going to happen. That is just the most base, unethical conduct by the White House press office that I have ever seen. If you don't want to answer the questions, they don't have to answer your questions. But to do this is just indicative of the utter lack of moral character of Donald Trump, who I'm sure approved and roughed out that statement.
David, are you saying you gave the 2 pages that you had for verification to them, and they gave those 2 pages out to other press outlets?
I don't know if they actually gave the 2 pages. They clearly gave the numbers out. There's some journalists who wrote about this. I have not read their stories. My wife has simply told me about them because I haven't had time to look at them. But it's very clear from various press reports. And when I was on another TV station today, the producer said to me, you know, did you know Trump gave out your story just before it went public at dcreport.org? And then I went on the Rachel Maddow show a minute later. That really is just not the way you do things. It lacks honor. Of course, Donald Trump lacks honor, so I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Donald Trump doesn't have any idea what honor is.
David K. Johnston, when you got this envelope that had the 2 pages in it, where were you?
I was using my cell phone to shoot a picture in Palm Beach of Mar-a-Lago from across the water because it was part of the research I was doing for my next Trump biography. I have a book out now, The Making of Donald Trump. I have a new one that'll come out at the end of the year. And that's when I got this message. And one of my 8 grown children said, "You won't believe what came in the mail," and then sent to my cell phone a PDF of the document. And I immediately said, I got to go to the airport and get back to work.
David, you talked about how much Donald Trump has paid in his taxes in 2005. In the response to you, they said, we have to get back to more serious work of changing the tax system. If he succeeds in changing the tax system, this alternative minimum tax that required that he pay even the amount he did, he would eliminate?
Yes. Donald Trump, in writing in his campaign documents, has said we're going to get rid of the alternative minimum tax. Well, of the $36.6 million in tax that he paid, more than $31 million was because of the alternative minimum tax. And the reason for that is that $103 million that was disallowed under the alternative minimum tax, it's allowed under the regular tax, disallowed under the alternative. Even with it being disallowed, Donald Trump, though, got a 20% discount on his taxes, and here's why. At that level of income in 2005, your tax rate is 35% of your income. But if you're on the alternative minimum tax, your tax rate's only 28%. That's 20% less. So he was only paying 80 cents on the dollar to begin with. And this is part of what I've been writing about for years. We really have a tax system in America that very effectively and efficiently taxes your wages, your labor income. But if, like Donald Trump, you're a business owner, and if, like Donald Trump, you're willing to buy aggressive and dubious tax shelters and do sketchy things, you can pay very little tax. And we know that there are at least 2 years when Donald Trump did not pay any income taxes, even though he had multi-million-dollar income, because he had to put some of that information into the public record.
Who do you believe sent you this, David?
Well, it's possible that Donald sent it, although his attacks on me today, he tweeted about me today, so I clearly got under his skin, suggest not. When Donald has leaked something about himself, he usually doesn't have a complaint. He didn't complain about the really crude pornographic pictures of his wife when she was a porn model, or the partial tax returns of his that were released last year, so I suspect those came from him. Most likely, this was somebody who's familiar with my work, knows that I have written a great deal about this idea of negative income and the alternative minimum tax, and trusted that I would get the maximum possible value out of these 2 pages.
And finally, if it were Donald Trump, why do you think he would do this? What even led you to think it might be?
Well, first of all, because Donald has a long, well-documented history of leaking things about himself, of posing as his own PR man and calling himself John Barron or John Miller, planting stories that famous, beautiful women were pounding on his bedroom door when, in fact, they had nothing to do with him. In this case, Donald wants to divert people from a couple of things. He wants to get us off thinking about his connections to the Russian oligarchs, which raise fundamental questions about whether he is loyal to the United States or disloyal. He wants to get people off what appears to be the fiasco with the Republican health care plan that he has put his name on without clearly understanding what it means, and that it contradicts his promises, and other matters. And Donald is very big, Amy, on distraction. He's always trying to get journalists, who are not well known for sticking to something for a long time. They're generally not book writers, to distract them and get them to go write about something else or put on TV something else. So that may also, if he were to have done it, that would be part of that strategy.
Well, David K. Johnston, thanks so much for spending this time. Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, previously with the New York Times, now founder and editor of DCReport.org, where he published Donald Trump's 2005 Form 1040 federal tax return. David's biography of Donald Trump is titled The Making of Donald Trump. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, famine. What the UN is doing about it, what the U.S. is doing about it. Stay with us.
I saw the knocking down his home. But the banks are made of marble, with a guard at every door, and the vaults are stuffed with silver that the farmers sweated for. I've seen the weary miner scrubbing coal dust from his back. I've heard his children cry, got no coal to heat the shack.
Banks of Marble, Iris Dement and Leo Kottke. Here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report, I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations has warned that the world is facing its largest humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War, with nearly 20 million people at risk of starvation in Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. The UN's humanitarian chief, Stephen O'Brien, told the UN Security Council Friday that $4.4 billion is needed by July to avert a famine.
We stand at a critical point in our history. Already at the beginning of the year, we are facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the creation of the United Nations. Now, more than 20 million people across 4 countries face starvation and famine. Without collective and coordinated global efforts, people will simply starve to death. All 4 countries have one thing in common: conflict. This means that we, you, have the possibility to prevent and end further misery and suffering. The UN and its partners are ready to scale up, but we need the access and the funds to do more. It is all preventable. It is possible to avert this crisis, to avert these famines, to avert these looming human catastrophes.
Last month, the UN declared a famine in parts of South Sudan, but O'Brien said the biggest crisis is in Yemen. Earlier this week, aid officials said they're in a race against time to prevent a famine brought on by a U.S.-backed Saudi-led war and blockade. Almost 19 million people in Yemen, 2/3 of the total population, are in need of assistance, and more than 7 million are facing starvation, an increase of 3 million since January. The executive director of the World Food Program said her agency had just 3 months' worth of food stored and that officials were only able to provide hungry Yemenis with about 1/3 of the rations they need. This all comes as the Trump administration is seeking billions of dollars in cuts in funding to the United Nations. To talk more about the crisis, we're joined by Joel Charney, director of the Norwegian Refugee Council USA. Joel, thanks so much for joining us. Can you talk about this worst humanitarian crisis since World War II?
Well, Stephen O'Brien described it very well. In 4 countries, because of conflict, only in 1 case, Somalia, do we have drought, which is also driving the deprivation. But in Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northern Nigeria, millions of people are on the brink of famine, largely because of the disruption of food production, the inability of aid agencies to get in, and just ongoing conflict, which is making life a misery for millions of people.
So let's start with Yemen, Joel. I mean, you have the picture of President Trump yesterday sitting with the Saudi leader in the White House. The war that's taking place in Yemen, the Saudi bombing backed by the United States. Can you talk about the effect this has had on the population?
It's been a relentless war with violations of international humanitarian law by the Saudis and the coalition that they're a part of, as well as by the Houthis that are resisting the Saudi assault. And from the beginning of the bombing, I mean, I vividly remember when the bombing first started, within the space of a couple weeks, the warehouses and office buildings of 3 or 4 non-governmental organizations working in Yemen were hit by the Saudi assault. And what's happened, Yemen imports 90% of its food, even in normal times. So this is not so much a disruption of food production, but it's a disruption of commerce due to the bombing, due to the blockade, due to the movement of the National Bank from Sana'a down to Aden. And taken all together, it's just creating an impossible situation in a country that's completely dependent on food imports for its survival.
On Monday, the World Food Program said they're in a race against time to prevent a famine in Yemen. This is the executive director, Etherine Cousin, who just returned from Yemen.
We have about 3 months of food stored inside the country today. We also have food that's on the water on the way there, but we don't have enough food to support the scale up that is required to ensure that we can avoid a famine. What we've been doing is taking the limited amounts of food that we have in the country and spreading it to as far as possible, which means that we've been giving 35% rations on most months. We need to go to 100% rations.
So the U.S. is supplying weapons for the Saudi campaign, the war campaign in Yemen. The strikes have increased. What do you think needs to happen to save the people of Yemen at this point?
At this point, really, the only solution is some kind of agreement between the parties to the conflict, the Saudis and their allies and the Houthis. And over the last year, 18 months, several times we've been close to seeing an agreement that would at least produce a ceasefire or end some of the relentless bombing that's been going on. Yet every time the agreement breaks down. And I mean, this is a case where if the war continues, people will die from famine. I don't think there's any question about that. We just have to find a way for the war to end. And right now, there's just a complete lack of diplomatic effort to try and solve this situation. And I think as a humanitarian representing the Norwegian Refugee Council, we can do what we can, you know, in the face of this conflict, but the fundamental solution is an agreement between the parties that will stop the war, open up commerce, you know, have the port be open, and allow, therefore, the aid machinery from the World Food Program and non-governmental organizations like NRC to function.
I mean, this is not the U.S. intervening and trying to broker an agreement between others. This is the U.S. directly involved in causing this conflict.
And, Amy, it needs to be stressed that this is not something that, you know, started on January 20th. Humanitarian agencies in Washington, you know, myself and my colleagues, we've been pointing out, dating back well into the last year of the Obama administration, that, you know, the bombing campaign was leading to an untenable humanitarian situation. And the U.S. support of that bombing campaign was highly problematic from a humanitarian standpoint. So, you know, this is something that the U.S. has been driving for some time. And again, as with many things right now, it has to be seen within the context of the war or the proxy war between, you know, the Saudis and Iran for, you know, control and supremacy in the Middle East. The Houthis are perceived as an Iranian proxy. Many dispute that, but that doesn't change the fact that there's an ongoing war that seems unable to be resolved. And we need, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the U.S. Perhaps it can come from the UN under the leadership of their new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. But we need a diplomatic initiative as it relates to Yemen to avert the famine.
I want to ask about the U.S. threats to cut billions of dollars in funding to the United Nations. Can you talk about the effect of this, and what is President Trump saying?
Well, the budget will come out tomorrow, but the report is that there'll be 50% cut across the board in Trump's budget for 2018. Now, the U.S. is a very significant supporter of the humanitarian arms of the United Nations as well as the UN across the board. But in the context of 20 million people being on the brink of famine, you're proposing to cut funding for the High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, for the World Food Program that Earthren Cousin represents, and for UNICEF. And those three agencies are on the UN's behalf on the front line of responding to the situations that we're talking about. So to call this ill-timed is an incredible understatement. I mean, and the other rumor, Amy, is that, you know, there are going to be devastating cuts to the U.S.'s own humanitarian funding through agencies like the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance and the Refugee Bureau at the State Department. So we're anxiously awaiting the release of the Trump budget tomorrow. But we're obviously quite concerned that in the context of the massive need that we're facing and the normal U.S. leadership that we see in responding to famine situations, these cuts, not just for the UN, but also for domestic, for our international response agencies and the U.S. government will be devastating.
I wanted to turn to the new UN Secretary General you referenced, Joel, Antonio Guterres, recently calling on greater international financial support.
One of the biggest obstacles we face now is funding. Humanitarian operations in these 4 countries require more than $5.6 billion this year. And we need at least $4.4 billion by the end of March to avert a catastrophe. Despite some generous pledges, just $90 million has actually been received so far, around 2 cents for every dollar needed. We are in the beginning of the year, but these numbers are very worrying. Funding shortages have already forced the World Food Program to cut rations in Yemen by more than half since last year. And without new resources, critical shortages will worsen within months.
That's Antonio Guterres, the new UN the new UN Secretary General. I want to turn to a mother of 9 children in South Sudan.
Currently, we have no food, and the entire family depends on water lily and date palm.
Joel Charney, can you talk about South Sudan?
South Sudan's a place where, you know, there was so much hope in 2011 when the country was founded after years of support from around the world, including from the United States. And basically the leaders of South Sudan decided that they would rather fight over ultimate control than govern their country in a way that worked for all their people. So South Sudan is a classic example of another famine or food shortage that's driven purely by conflict in this, with an ethnic dimension, but also a political dimension, unresolved political conflicts within the South Sudanese ruling class that date all the way back to the 90s, that were covered up during the independence struggle but have since emerged. And again, in South Sudan, we face just immense logistical difficulties in reaching people like the woman you just showed. And we have to overcome obstacles from the government itself. We have to overcome logistical difficulties. We have to make sure that we can work safely in the midst of conflict. And South Sudan has oil. South Sudan has relatively fertile soil to feed itself. And the issue is just the inability of the authorities and working with outside aid agencies to come together to meet the needs of the people of South Sudan. And it is a desperate situation. Of the four countries that we're discussing, South Sudan is the one place where a famine has officially been declared in one part of the country, affecting 100,000 people.
And can you talk about Somalia and Nigeria, Joel Charney?
Well, Somalia, I mean, Amy, I know I'm depressing your listeners, but I mean, Somalia is the one place, I think, where a rapid response actually can make a difference, because although there is conflict in Somalia, the famine threat this time, the severe drought, is mainly in parts of the country that are reachable by the government, as weak as it is, and reachable by the international aid community. So if we're able to mobilize quickly, and this is what everyone's saying right now, if we're able to mobilize food and cash quickly, we can overcome the situation of Somalia if we get moving. In Nigeria, it's a question of, Boko Haram is disrupting areas in the northern part of the country. There's been a response by the Nigerian government that has, led to people being driven into camps and away from their homes. And because of the conflict there, food production has been disrupted. It's very difficult to reach people. And again, from the perspective of an outside agency like Norwegian Refugee Council, the key in northern Nigeria is either to reach some kind of peace agreement or at least a way to prosecute the war that doesn't disrupt life in villages and doesn't harm people who are so vulnerable.
I wanted to end by going back to where we began in Yemen. President Trump met with Saudi Arabia's Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at the White House Tuesday, during which the two reportedly discussed their opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. They also are expected to discuss U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia for this ongoing Saudi-led bombardment of Yemen, which has killed thousands. Amnesty International urged Trump to block the arms sales, writing, "Arming the Saudi Arabia and Bahraini governments risks complicity with war crimes, and doing so while simultaneously banning travel to the U.S. from Yemen would be even more unconscionable." Joel, tonight at midnight begins what they call the Muslim ban 2.0. When people from 6 countries, including Yemen, will not be allowed into the United States unless it's stopped in court. How does this go together with what you're seeing right now in these places?
Well, as people have pointed out, 4 of the 6 countries in the ban are currently in conflict in which the U.S. is involved. And our view on the ban is very simple. The people in these countries, and indeed refugees worldwide, are among the most vulnerable in the world. They are vetted before they come to the United States, and it's just an absolute priority from our standpoint that the U.S. remain open to the most vulnerable refugees, and that we have an immigration program that from these countries that allows people to reunify with their families, to study in the U.S. and so on. So, this contrast between assaulting, having wars going on, yet not being able to be a safe haven is obviously a clear and worrying contrast.
Joel Charney, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of the Norwegian Refugee Council USA, and of course we'll continue to cover the story. When we come back, why are 8 men scheduled to die in Arkansas within 10 days? We'll talk about the reason. Stay with us.
She's been sleeping on a bed of stone by a window where no light goes. She wakes to the roar of the traffic rumbling outside. Then she remembers a dream and smiles. Yeah, she smiles. On her dress she irons the folds.
Bed of Stone by Asha. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The state of Arkansas is planning to execute 8 men within 10 days in April. That's nearly a quarter of its entire death row population. Earlier this month, Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson signed proclamations setting 4 execution dates for the 8 prisoners between April 17th and 27th, which would be an unprecedented rate of execution in modern U.S. history. Arkansas suspended execution since 2005 amidst challenges in acquiring lethal injection drugs and lawsuits over the drugs used. Arkansas says it's rushing the executions because the state's supply of the sedative midazolam will soon expire. For more, we're going to Philadelphia, where we're joined by Megan McCracken, attorney with the Death Penalty Clinic, University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Megan, can you explain what exactly is happening? Because a drug is about to expire, 8 men will be executed within 10 days?
That's right. The state of Arkansas has said that because its current supply of midazolam expires at the end of April, it has scheduled these 8 executions very close together, 4 days within the course of 11 days, in order to use the drug before it expires.
What is midazolam?
Midazolam is an anti-anxiety drug, a benzodiazepine. It is potent as an anti-anxiety drug, and it's used perioperatively around surgery. But it is not an anesthetic drug. So that means it's not used to take a person who is awake and conscious and used alone. It's not used alone to put that person under surgical anesthesia and then keep that person there. And the reason that's relevant is because that's what's needed for an execution to be humane, to comport with the Constitution. And so this drug is inappropriate for the task, and so you have this situation created by the state where it's rushing to use a drug before it expires, even though the drug itself is inappropriate for the use and
Who supplies it?
Guarantee. I'm sorry?
Who supplies it?
That's not known. Arkansas, like many states, has secrecy surrounding its execution procedures and specifically protects that type of information, how they got the drugs, who made it, exactly what that product is.
It's been linked to painful, botched executions in states like Alabama and other places. Can you explain when you talk about it's not even the proper drug?
Right. So because it's not an anesthetic drug, it cannot maintain anesthesia, meaning it can't keep the prisoner insensate to pain and suffering. We've seen time and time again when midazolam is used in executions, things don't go as planned. And so we have seen executions like Dennis McGuire in Ohio, Clayton Lockett in Oklahoma, Joe Wood in Arizona, where the prisoner remained alive much longer than anticipated. And then the eyewitnesses describe struggling, writhing, gasping.
Let me go to the January 16, 2014 execution in Ohio of Dennis McGuire using an untested 2-drug method despite warnings it might cause immense suffering. The execution took 25 minutes. His son, also named Dennis, witnessed the execution.
Shortly after the warden buttoned his jacket to signal start of the execution, my dad began gasping and struggling to breathe. I watched his stomach heave. I watched him try to sit up against the straps on the gurney. I watched him repeatedly clench his fist. It appeared to me he was fighting for his life, but suffocating. The agony and terror of watching my dad suffocate to death lasted more than 19 minutes. It was the most awful moment in my life to witness my dad's execution. I can't think of any other way to describe it than torture.
That's Dennis McGuire, son of Dennis McGuire, executed by the state of Ohio in 2014. Megan, we have 30 seconds. Is this set in stone that these men will be executed in Arkansas? I mean, this country has never seen anything like this.
That's right. I mean, that is certainly the plan that Arkansas has for moving forward. But it's not an appropriate plan. This drug is not effective and appropriate for this use, and there's no reason to rush to carry out these executions by the end of April when other drugs are available, and even this drug continues to be available to other states. And so it's really a manufactured situation that can be avoided.
Megan McCracken, we want to thank you for being with us, attorney with the Death Penalty Clinic at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And that does it for our broadcast. Check our job listings at DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Andre Lewis, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Paul Huckabee, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.